Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm talking to Coach Kassem. We're delving initially into his current training setup. Why is it set up the way it is? I thought that was very interesting and I think you'll enjoy that. And then we have a long discussion delving into the literature that's been coming out about training at different muscle lengths and how that's having an impact on muscle hypertrophy and whether or not that's changed any of Kassem's programming or even his views on exercise selection. And I think that's going to be a really interesting chat for you guys. As always, if you enjoyed this, please do give us a like or give us a comment, depending on where you're listening or watching this, and share this with anyone you think might enjoy it. It really helps the podcast grow. But without further ado, let's get into the show. Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Coach Kassem back on the show. I don't know why I always call you Coach Kassem, and sometimes I call you Kass. And I don't. What's your preferred way of being spoken to? Kassem, Kass, Coach Kassem, Kassem Hanson.
I don't know if I really have one. I used to hate Kass, when I was younger, because I had an aunt named Kass. And so I was like, well, that's the girls' version or whatever. But I don't know. In the last decade, I've just kind of succumbed to it. And so now it's just like, oh yeah, that's me too, right? People named exercises after Kass now. So it's
yes,
like, oh, whatever.
Kass bullshit. We've got that.
Yes. It's on, I guess there you go. Well, that's what's on the t-shirt. So Kass is fine. Right.
I know, I don't know, I think it's Alberto Nunez is another person who I call him sometimes. Sometimes I'm Berto, Alberto, Nunez, like so many different, at least it's like your names and it's not like, don't know, big American dude or something. I'm trying to think of a guy with a beard, something like that. So anyway, we have Kassem or Kass back on the show. He was actually last on solo. He's been on obviously several times as part of kind of debates and roundtables and those sort of things. And I have to give my hand to Kass in how you deal with those every time, because I having had followed you for a while, I can see how much you are just after the truth and the right answer, which I highly appreciate, because I don't know, in this industry, as you know, some people have different kind of goals with these things, but the more I've seen your work through social media, listened to you on podcasts, had you on the show, I can tell how much you haven't got that kind of ulterior motive, as it were. You are after kind of just the best outcomes. I guess I don't need you to confirm that, because you'd be like, no, Steve, this isn't true. But yeah, obviously. So last time he was on was episode 298. It was Understanding Biomechanics for More Gains. That was actually a year ago now. So yeah, it's been a while since we've had a one-on-one chat, and something I don't know if you've ever spoken about, you probably have somewhere, but I haven't caught it, was normally when I have repeat guests on, I know they train, I know you train, Kass, I normally dig into what they're currently doing with their training. So I don't know if that's something you've spoken about or even interested in, but it might be interesting to the listeners. So I thought we'd start there.
So my personal training for me, it kind of fluctuates through periods where I'll have a focus, but it gets interrupted by, we'll say, my curiosity in the research we're doing. So yesterday is a prime example. Yesterday was supposed to be a lower body day for me, but instead I spent an hour doing a bunch of trial variations for some glute bias lunges and things that we were doing, trying to use, different tools and different things, working on some prototype rigs for equipment design and stuff. So my structured training just didn't happen, right? I just sacrificed it for, hey, I'm just going to take my fatigue that I can tolerate and I'm going to put it towards this today. So my personal training is basically I think the way Joey coined it was fending off decay, is kind of that. So I go through periods of okay, stay strong, keep my muscle, and put as much fatigue towards the science as possible. And then occasionally I'll take a break, okay, now I essentially do, what you would call a mini cut of all right, cool, that other training, while maybe hard or whatever, wasn't necessarily the most productive. So now I need a period of very focus. And to be honest, I will see a very, we'll say, abrupt change in my physique in just a week or two of okay, now I'm actually training for me versus just doing random stuff and working hard, right? So the specificity is is noticeable. But I mean, so much of my time in the gym is spent tinkering and workshopping and stuff. I think that's part of what has led me to, be so driven for efficiency in training. Because it's like, okay, when I only have small windows to make progress, I need those to be as productive as possible. Or if I only have a certain amount of time, a certain amount of fatigue, a certain amount of whatever, like I need more out of everything that I can do at this point in my career, because I'm not 25 years old and I can just, just go to the gym and eat and sleep and whatever. Now it's like I'm running a business and I have all these other things, and I'm not contrary to what some people like, oh, well, why aren't you like at 4% body fat? I'm like, I'm not a bodybuilder, right? Like I enjoy training, but also like, it's like in terms of all of the things, like, for me, I put my training into a place of where it needs to be a positive thing, meaning like it needs to be an energizing thing. It needs to be improving my focus. Same thing for my diet. It can't be bringing me down. So like I'll go through periods where, okay, I'm going to sacrifice some productivity and some energy to train a little bit harder, bring the calories down into a deficit. But probably, 3/4 of the year, it's all about, hey, how do I just have the best functioning Kass, right, while doing this stuff, and then being able to push forward, because it's more important for me at this stage to use my training as we'll say a way of maintaining my productivity in other areas, right? I don't have any aspirations of getting on a bodybuilding stage or anything like that, right? Like, so yeah, I might be boring to your audience. That's more like, hey, just physique, but the byproduct is this is how we, this is part of me, coming up with like, oh, hey, here's a different way to set up in this that's a little bit better, or that stuff wouldn't happen if I was like, hey, I'm going to do the same thing for 12 weeks, completely unchanged, same setup, same technique, whatever. Well, the innovations would come very, very slow if my personal training was like that, and everything that we did in the lab was like that, instead of it's just, hey, it's this constant, like, how could we make this better? Let's try that. Not so much. Oh, but this one here, that was a winner, that sort of thing.
It makes a ton of sense, and I appreciate kind of the idea behind like specificity, and then also priorities and what you're trying to push. Anyone listening who, like, we have a lot of physique competitors or people who are into that, like when you're even pushing the bounds of massing, like, and you're in potentially an overreaching period, and you can't concentrate, you can't work as well, it takes longer. Like you said, you're trying to be efficient with your training, and then especially dieting, like cognitive function is nowhere near as good as it should be. So it makes a lot of sense that actually your training and nutrition is really built to support like your work and your education and your kind of, I guess, research that you're doing. So that makes tons of sense to me. And it's funny, those tinkering periods, just like you mentioned, they only really come about for me when I'm like taking a deload week or what have you, and I try something different. And that's something I was doing this week with, because you sent a video across to me, which I appreciate, with Brian Bornstein, and trying out some of these like lat pull around versions. I've been trying them out this week to kind of get the hang of them. And I was just thinking where you spoke about like how you had like leg training planned and you did glutes. I wonder if sometimes you come out of like the gym, you're like, this muscle group is just wrecked, because I've been tinkering with so many different things. And because that kind of happened to me with these pull arounds, where I was like, oh dear, like I haven't even pushed them to failure, but the volume has just accumulated because I've been tinkering so much.
You could think of like the most like horrific workout that you come up with, the soreness of spending a whole day doing nothing but novel exercises that you're completely unfamiliar with will screw you up way more. And it's even more surprising because, like, you're not like timing rest intervals or whatnot, so sometimes you're just doing stuff over and over and over again, and like the curiosity gets the better of you, or other times it's just like the volume sneaks up on you, because there'll be times in like, well, man, we've been doing this for 4 hours, right? Like in the context of a workout that would be insane, but when we're sitting here and we're doing lab work and we're tinkering with machines and moving things or whatever, not to mention sometimes I am literally moving machines, so like in between the actual exercise, like, picking up, like not lifting the machine like as the exercise, but actually moving the equipment, like, oh, that's a part of my erectors that I haven't been using in training, picking up this super awkward object. So it's interesting. And the other thing I didn't think to mention is that we get people through. So like Dr. Pat Davidson was just here. So sometimes my training is like, all right, Pat's here. He's got his thing that he's focusing on. I'm just going to train with Pat. And so I have those too, like where we get people in and it's like, all right, what are you going to train? Well, whatever this person wants to do, I'm going to show them the N1 version of that.
Yeah.
And that's going to be my training for the week. So that was supposed to be a deload week for me, but instead it became like, well, Pat's here. Let's crush Pat. And then of course, then there's the ego and the competitive aspect of it or whatever that goes into that. So it's like, okay, deload or just go over the top this week. And that's what it ended up being, right?
Yeah.
Deload next week.
So you sacrifice your physique and your training for everyone else's, actually, in a sense.
Yeah. I enjoy it, though. I enjoy it.
Good. Yeah, I have to say, though, I wonder what your background is in terms of, because it's not like you're a small, skinny individual. Like, you've got heaps of muscle on you. You're a big built guy. So when you get comments around, I don't know, people can only comment on body fat, I guess, which is like, if you're not shredded, then you're not Instagram worthy, whatever. But you're a big guy. You've got plenty of muscle. Did you previously, I don't think you competed in bodybuilding or powerlifting, or maybe you did, but did you have a bodybuilding focus in the past at all?
My hypertrophy goals were mainly sports orientated, and then that kind of just rolled into a passion for training. I think, I had a small aspiration of hey, maybe bodybuilding was a thing that I would want to do, but I kind of ended up in a similar situation when I was coaching where we'll say my peak interest in bodybuilding happened at probably the peak of my coaching career in terms of just the amount of clients and stuff that I was doing. And so basically that didn't seem feasible at that point in time. Because at that point in time, I was in a career where, you needed a ton of clients to basically make the money, whatever, didn't have any, online courses and these events and stuff like that. It was more like, hey, I got to train tons and tons of these people to make ends meet. And so I kind of despite that, I kind of made the same decision of okay, I enjoy this process, but I can't take it all the way and still be coaching these other people, right, through their preps. And I don't know, I mean, that's just kind of how it ended up working out. This is okay, I'm just going to keep doing the training. If the opportunity presents itself, great. And it just never really did, right? I just became a better and better and busier coach, and then eventually an educator. And there never seemed to be the point where it's okay, now's the time to put all that on hold and, hey, let's go do a show. And I I don't like being hungry. So I would be a terrible bodybuilder. That's what people oh, why don't you do it? And I'm I will do the hardest training. I hate being hungry. I don't like the feeling. And more importantly, I hate the fact that I am operating at in some sort of cognitive decline, right? Because what makes me happy all day is pursuing the problem solving and the intellectual aspects of this. So it's a huge deficit for me from a productivity standpoint when I go into a deficit. Which is why basically when I do it, I don't know if you've seen any of the things I do, I will go very extreme for 4 or 6 weeks, because I will be okay, look, this is a period of time where I'm actually going to shift what I'm doing in my life to things that I can do that don't require maybe as much creative thought and stuff like that. If you have to sit down and write, you write articles and stuff like that, that stuff is so much harder. You can answer questions. I can tell when people are deep in prep sometimes. The amount of Q&As they do goes up, because it's hey, nothing good is organically going to come out of my brain. I need people to pull it out of me. And it's okay. So it's I can tell sometimes okay, this person's doing a lot of Q&As, and that's because that's the only way that stuff can actually get processed out of their mind and come out, is somebody has to actually extract it on the other side. Because if you just sit here and try and do it organically, you just just melt into the screen.
No, I can definitely appreciate the creativity side going down, and I've definitely I imagine my Q&As were probably like that as well. And I was going to think you were going to say you can tell by their answers to the Q&A sometimes the irritability coming through or the shortness coming through, which I can also sometimes see. Yeah. Awesome. I think that's really interesting to hear. Yeah, what kind of, your previous kind of history of training, and again, like I bring it back to Instagram, everyone feels like, I don't know, if you're not a competitor, then who are you or whatever. It's like, you don't have to compete. Like loving training doesn't mean you kind of have to take it to the stage. And it sounds like it would only have like, I can't really think of many positives it would have for you. And just like, again, like crush your creative process. So something, a bigger topic that I wanted to talk about today, and I haven't managed to speak to you about this yet, but I've asked almost every kind of guest that's come over onto the podcast for the last like 4 to 6 months, is about training and some of the data that's coming out about the effect of kind of training at longer muscle lengths and training at this kind of longer range of motion, I guess, in some instances. And I'd just love to hear if you have any kind of big take homes from that research and how you have applied that to some of kind of your exercise selection or programming. I know we mentioned kind of pull arounds. I think it probably helped you kind of confirm that that was a direction you wanted to move in, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts surrounding it.
I think, I mean, I don't know like how long people have been focusing on that. You have like Dante Trudell that did, the DC style training and whatnot, but doing length and bias stuff in hypertrophy phases has been like something that we've been applying for a decade, like in reverse drop sets and lengthened partials and stuff like that. And a lot of that was built on anecdote before. And we had previously kind of made this correlation of like, I wonder if it's like one of the mechanisms is more muscle damage because these positions seem to result in greater soreness, and fatigue and stuff like that. So I'd say like the biggest insights are kind of right now looking at one, what the possible mechanisms are going there, kind of like moving away from, okay, there may be more damage, but that's not the reason for the growth, right? It's more likely like, having the model that we currently have for Titan, this is like, all right, it's probably just that we're simultaneously able to get greater mechanical tension in these positions. So I think that's been cool because that's kind of changed like the approach of like programming this of like, okay, if we're looking at this, is it a dose response thing that we need to go through? Like, how does that affect how we would, pair this with other stuff? How does that affect the amount of volume that we would use at these things? When you're kind of looking, because if you're looking at, well, the mechanism is damage, then we were thinking like, well, then just destroy it, like just annihilate the tissue. Like, so we'd have like a phase where like that was the goal. Like, okay, all the things that like really disrupt you, just take them to 11 for a short period of time, because that would be what you'd be trying to accomplish for that phase. So I'd say like the biggest changes is that in implementing those, it's been more so of instead of having like super aggressive shorter phases that are just like as lengthened and as eccentrically overloaded as possible, it's probably moving more towards like I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, but that's like a complex conversation if you want to get into it again. But I think that now it's more like, hey, in general, from a hypertrophy phase, you need to kind of find your tolerable threshold of these types of exercises, because I think there is a threshold in like, how much of a certain stimulus you can get in a session, and also like just when the ROI of that continued stimulus is still beneficial, right? And you could look at that for a variety of exercise variables, but the quad study, I think it's the Pedrosa one, I think that's one of the good examples where when you look at that's the lengthen versus the shortened partials and the leg extension, and you look at, they had a group that did varied, meaning they did both the lengthened partial and the shortened partial. They just basically split the volume 50%. I can't remember how they split it, whether it was like alternating days, or I think that's what it was, is that one day they did the length and the other day they did the shorten. I may be wrong on that. It may have been half and half during each session. I can't remember, but they split the volume across there. Is that like when you look at that, and I know we're just looking at one study, but it's like, okay, the varied group actually outperformed the full ROM group and was very close in hypertrophy to the lengthened partial only. So like if you look at, the results of that study, it's like, well, the lengthened partial had the highest hypertrophy outcome. And then just right under that was the varied group. And then under that was the full ROM. And then the least amount was the short partial only. And there's a lot of different ways that you could kind of look at that and be like, okay, does that mean that the volume they were doing in the length and partial was kind of past the high ROI, meaning that if they would have done half the volume, they would have gotten, 90% of the results or from that, and adding the short position really wasn't adding anything? Or is it something that like having both of those had some sort of complementary benefit that is better when those two parts are separated rather than just doing full range of motion? Like there's different ways that you could look at that, but so like when I'm looking at the research, I tend to try and look at each study in a very detailed fashion, like kind of the opposite of a meta-analysis. Is
Yeah.
like a meta-analysis, you're trying to take like the most general aspect and the consistency across the studies, where I try to look at a single study and be like, what principal information could I possibly take from this? And then do that to another and another and another, and then kind of put that in my head and do kind of my own quote unquote like internal meta-analysis of the principal possibilities of what's going on in these. And so I think the dosage has been something that we have been playing around with. And the other thing is, well, how long does it need to be? So I remember it was probably like, I think it was probably like 5 years ago. I was trying to actually have a discussion with Mike on the, this is when right before Team Full ROM like became a thing, because I was looking at it and it's like, look, all of the full ROM data seems to only be superior when that full ROM includes the length and position, right? So is it like, so my, like back then I was already, the signal seems to be that we either have to have the stretch or we have to have the peak resistance portion. Like those seem to be the things that we're actually correlating in these things, more so than just like more range of motion is better. Because like when they did the bottom half of the squat versus the full squat, well, then the full squat wasn't better. But when they did the, the full squat versus the top half, and I'm like, well, I think like everybody that trains probably was like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Just, just an experience. Um, so we've been implementing this stuff a lot for a long period of time. And some of the reasons, like, so take for instance, pauses in the lengthened position. You could look at that as that's one way of like, well, we're spending more time there. But if we look at all of the research right now, the couple studies that do not show, excuse me, a bias towards the lengthened partial being better were exercises where the resistance was dropping off during the eccentric, meaning that like, so you have the incline curl versus the preacher curl study. So it's an incline dumbbell curl versus the preacher curl study. And not the best study by any means. But I mean, because the incline curl got zero hypertrophy after like, I can't remember, but they were doing a pretty decent amount of volume and they got zero hypertrophy. So anytime I see that, I'm like, what's like, I mean, I know some exercises are better than others, but like, is the incline curl that bad that it should produce zero hypertrophies in a relatively novice population? When I see that, I'm kind of like, how are the protocols? How are the controls? Like, should there have been some sort of like, what's going on there? But all that aside, the preacher curl, while being at a shorter muscle length, outperformed the incline dumbbell curl, which would have been a longer muscle length. But the difference being that in a preacher curl, you're still being challenged all the way to the lengthened portion of the exercise. Where in a dumbbell curl or an incline dumbbell curl, as you're lowering it, the weight is getting lighter. It's getting easier as you're going to the bottom. And the other example where the short partial beat out, I can't remember if it was full range or lengthened partial, but it was a tricep skull crusher type movement. And the group that basically went from the top to like a 90-90 position. So shoulder at 90, elbow at 90. So basically holding your forearm parallel over your head. That group outperformed the group that came all the way down. So again, the scenario would have been is one group, the load was basically increasing as they were doing the eccentric. And in another group, it was dropping off. And so that seems to put the signal in that we need, there's probably something about training at a longer muscle length, but there's also probably something about having that resistance at least stay adequate, because when we look at the leg extension, leg curl, I can't I don't know what the resistance profile of those machines were. Like, I wish I had that data. Like, I wish that was part of these studies to be able to have that. Because in a dumbbell or a free weight exercise, I can do the mechanics. I can know what the resistance profile or the resistance challenge of that exercise would be. But if it's a machine, unless they at least provide a picture of the machine or something, I have no idea, right? So many of those machines are different, right? You know, like we have the prime equipment. It can be whatever you want on the day. Um, so you never know. But I'm assuming that there was at least we'll say, fairly consistent challenge through the full range of motion of those exercises, right? I'm assuming it wasn't such an aggressive, cam on there or whatever, that one position was extremely light or whatnot. It was probably fairly consistent. The cheaper the equipment actually tends to be more about just a linear resistance in those machines. It's only when you get to like the more expensive that they're actually, there's a cam specifically designed to try and match the strength curve or something. So I assume that if anything, it was probably we'll say a cheaper style, like just circular cam, consistent resistance. But so when I'm looking deep into this and I'm like, okay, what's the consistent thing in the few instances where we're not seeing this lengthened hypertrophy? And I'm like, okay, well, it seems that eccentric has to be loaded in a way that you are either maintaining or increasing tension as you're getting long, because that's exactly what's happening in a squat, right? The leg extension, leg curl probably, stayed somewhat consistent. The tricep studies, that's another one where in the exercises that I can determine what the resistance would have been, that pattern seems to hold. But in some of them, I don't know how they orientated themselves with the cable. So they're just like, oh, we did an overhead thing and we did a standing thing. And I'm like, well, okay, you can show me a position of, like, you can show me a skeleton standing and, in an open sim image of it overhead. But that doesn't tell me what the exercise was, right? Because it's like, I can't see, like, that cable could have been pulling straight down, could have been pulling at 45 degrees. Like, who knows? And so that's a potential variable in theirs. And so maybe that explains a bit of the inconsistency, because there was one overhead tricep, study, I believe. It was only like 6 weeks or whatever. And this is the one that, like, it's like, oh, well, their fascicle links didn't increase, so they must not have been getting this or whatever. I'm like, well, I mean, what if the cable was orientated in that study where it was kind of getting lighter? Because it's actually, like, if anybody's ever done an overhead, tricep motion, if you don't have the cable like pulling straight down towards your butt, it's very easy for it to get lighter at the bottom if it's coming off at any sort of an angle, right? So that you could essentially rest there. So I would, I'm hoping to like talk to Milo, or is it Milo or Milo?
I always say Milo.
Milo, yeah. And Dr. Pack about their study. It's probably too late, but I'm going to be very curious of, like, hey, what considerations have you done in the exercise selection for the lengthened partials, right?
Yeah.
If I'm rambling here, stop me. But one thing that I think is interesting is how much people don't realize they're already doing some of these things just naturally in training. So
yeah.
Do you do dumbbell presses?
Yeah. I have actually
That's
got them in the
lengthened
program at the
partial.
moment. Yeah.
Yeah. That exercise in itself is a lengthened partial for chest, because the other 50% of the motion would be bringing the arm all the way across. So even though the exercise that you're pressing it all the way up and down, from a physiological perspective, that is basically just the bottom half of the chest motion. And everybody's been growing their chest off of doing barbell presses, dumbbell presses, machine presses. Like, they haven't all been doing, like, press around things for the short position, like even flies and stuff like that. If you're doing them bilaterally, you're only coming like a few degrees shorter, right? And all of those exercises, like all those dumbbell presses or whatever, they all, like, the resistance increases as you lower them. So there's so many instances, like a squat, it gets you to full knee extension, but if you were to look at the resistance, it's pretty much biased to the bottom half of the motion.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting if you take both that, hey, there seems to be a long muscle length signal, and there also seems to be a certain amount of load that needs to be on the eccentric, and it needs to kind of increase or at least maintain as we're getting into that lengthened position. And then you just look at the exercise selection that people have gravitated to over time is like, hey, these are the whatever. Like a lot of those fit that category of like, well, these are already kind of lengthened exercises, either in range of motion, resistance, or both. Is that happenstance? Is that coincidence? I don't know. And then to me, I've always noticed in coaching, certain people struggle with certain body parts. But I would say, in my experience coaching athletes, way more people struggled developing a good back than a good chest. Like, just like if I had to say, okay, what is it? I would say, man, it's probably close to like 80-20 of the people that would be like, and everybody that like wanted a chest, it was just, they just needed more upper chest. Like they're
Sure.
just like, oh, I just need to figure out how to target these fibers. It wasn't like, I just can't get my chest to grow ever. I mean, some people would have small rib cages or flat or whatever, but like you can't change that. But in terms of people that would just have like, like high lats used to be like a condition, that people thought they had, like, oh, I got high lats, is there a pill for that?
High lat
But
inserts.
if
I
you
know
look
that
at,
I
yeah,
had said that in the
right.
past about myself. And I was like, no, it doesn't make sense.
And I'm like, no, you just have really small lats, and
Yep.
that's why they look high, because it's the lats are this thin sheet muscle that runs over all of your back. So if it's not very thick, well, you're just gonna see erectors and teres, and that's what it's gonna look like, right? Um, but if you look at lat training, it's the opposite, meaning that the majority of exercises are actually training they're short and
Yeah.
partial, right? And that's why it's like, okay, well, the pull around, that seems like maybe that's something that we should be really focusing on more. Like my position has always been with the work that we do is, I don't know what the future research is going to say, in terms of, hey, is there benefit to going all the way short? Is there benefit to going all the way long? Is there benefit to having to do full range of motion? Do we have to do both? Like, what type of resistance is like? So I have the best guess based off of what we have now, but who knows? Maybe, somebody's going to find out that there's a particular benefit, to this. Who knows? Maybe doing the short positions, like, because it's got a special coordination challenge, is good and prevents Alzheimer's in the brain. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's a cool thing, right? Who knows? Like, what's going to happen? So my position has always been like, why don't we just give people the ability to do whatever they want? Teach them how to fully shorten a muscle, how to fully lengthen a muscle, how to take every tissue they want through its full range of motion, and then be able to extrapolate how to work multiple tissues at once versus be more biased or isolated. And then it's like, no matter where the research goes, they have that in their toolbox. And so that's why, like, lately we have been focusing a little bit more on the lengthened stuff. At least, I mean, it's always been a focus, but you
Yeah.
see it more on social media now, because that's where the interest is. And a lot of times when it comes to social, I have to upgrade, or I have to improve the way that I can communicate the information, because I don't get to do it over the course of several hours with illustrations and a skeleton and walking through exercises. Like, okay, how do I explain this in 60 seconds to people that don't have any formal education, in
Yeah.
this? And it's a failure like 90% of the time, at least for some people, right? And I just accepted that. But that's kind of that's the reason we've gotten there. I know that was kind of like a big circular thought process, but
Yeah.
so the things that have changed are, for me is like, okay, kind of where we're putting this, the dosing, and then some of the application stuff. I don't know how much you want to get into that, but the different ways of going after the lengthened position, whether you try and make it part of a a fuller rep versus a partial rep versus a pause, whether you do it at the end, whether you do it as its own thing or whatnot, like putting more effort into experimenting with those things, is something we've been doing. And I've slightly like over the probably like past year or so, I've kind of slightly tweaked the way we use pauses versus partials. Like anecdotally, this has kind of been something that we've been on, but like when we're focusing more on, say, we call it a neuro block or something, where maybe you're focusing more on strength or coordination of movement, or maybe even you're just trying to improve the skill of a movement, is that doing pauses in the lengthened position seem to be very, very good. Like if you're trying to teach somebody
Sure.
to like not bounce out of the bottom of a squat, improve their technique, pauses are great.
Yeah.
if you're trying to actually get them to, you know, control their tempo, pauses are great because kind of removing the passive component, I think improves the, like, you have to recruit more motor units because you simply lose the passive tension. So you have to get that force from a different mechanism. And I think in doing so, kind of just accelerates the learning curve of an exercise. So I think pauses are a great thing to throw in. Like if you were like previously like just doing full range of motion, but you weren't doing it that control, like a pause, while it may not be something that really adds a bunch of length and hypertrophy stimulus, because essentially the passive tension is kind of dissipating there. I think of it as like, this would be the great prep before you would start doing length and partials and stuff, like actually give you better ownership over the technique and the positions, right? So like for some of these motions, you know, you're putting yourself in, I don't want to say like precarious positions, but you are putting yourself in a position where, you know, you're closer to the joint end range and stuff like that. So it's probably worth having good technique, good skill, right? And kind of understanding your actual capacity there. You know, because your like how you gauge your RER for full repetitions may feel very, very different than doing, you know, quarter reps at the bottom of something or whatnot, right? Like it might be a total experience and like failure might hit you by surprise, or you may like have a harder time judging whether or not your technique is breaking down because you kind of have a smaller movement to look at. So I think a responsible thing to do is to make sure that you have the skill components for those things before you try and just throw a bunch of load and effort into them. So we look at it as like, all right, pauses is better for improving the neurological outcome and as a potential great way to enhance somebody's skill and technique. But if your goal is, if we're just looking at physiological hypertrophy, partials from a mechanical tension perspective probably are pushing that stimulus much further, even though pauses make the lengthened position harder. They do it by a means that kind of decreases your output. Like, so then actual mechanical tension stimulus is likely going down. Right.
Interesting.
But your ability to tolerate that and improve your technique is likely going up. So one of the things we'll do sometimes is we'll actually, that'll be one of the progressions we'll make over a meso, right? Like for somebody when the exercise is novel, incorporate a pause, drop the pause, which will immediately allow them to progressively overload. And then could eventually work into then adding some sort of partial or, you know, reverse drop sets and things like that, you know, so that there's like a progression over the meso into that, rather than, hey, here's a brand new exercise that's already novel, and now let's take you to a novel degree of effort and fatigue and stuff onto that's probably, you're probably doing more than you need to benefit like in the early part of the meso there, right? Like the equivalent of just doing way more sets than you would need to at the beginning of the meso.
All of that makes a ton of sense, Kass, and very, very interesting. I think particularly that kind of practical application of thinking about going into these length and partials or going into these longer muscle lengths and taking that longer position and that deeper position that you'll get into a little bit slower, potentially pausing it there, because you're definitely right. Because you're not gonna like slam down and then pause. Like you need to slow yourself in and then pause, like put the brakes on and then come to a complete halt type of thing. And I've also found when I pause like that, or I do that approach where it's slow into length and then potentially pause, it allows me to even potentially get a bit more length that I otherwise wouldn't have had if I just like rebounded quickly out of it. A question I do have is, you mentioned it seems that we want exercises that take us to that long muscle length, but also load it well, essentially. Does that for you mean exercises such as like a dumbbell lateral raise, where at the bottom there is not like that tension that you would have up at the top where it's hardest, so it's kind of the opposite profile? Does that mean that exercise becomes less useful, or even a length and partial for that motion would be less useful?
Well, this is a good example because there's different ways you can try and progress into making like that exercise more length and bias, right? So one way would be simply trying to move the weights faster from the beginning, right? So like actually trying to generate more momentum, but that only works on the concentric. And so if one of the main benefits, and this is kind of what I see, this is my hypothesis, is that the eccentric component is probably where the majority of this, we'll say, bonus that we're getting from these longer muscle lengths is coming from, is going to that in a, we'll say, loaded eccentric. This is like, well, okay, so we concentrically made it more difficult to come out of the bottom. But in order to reverse that, you would basically have to let the dumbbells fly down and then try and stop them like suddenly at the bottom. And to me, that's not responsible training, right? To me, that's how you end up on, gym memes or something like that. Especially if you get strong. Like the last thing that you want to do is like, just smash yourself on the hip with a 50-pound, dumbbell, right? And then drop it on your foot because you hit yourself on the hip or something like that. Just like, to me, I'm like, okay, that just seems like a terrible idea. Don't ever put that in the ether, right? So just, like disclaimer right there, like do not do that. So then you're like, well, okay, well, what about lengthen part? What about like, just doing just partials at the bottom? And it's like, okay, well, that potentially is now better because now you don't have to lower it like ridiculously to try and get that, right? So you could just do, you could either extend a set like to where you can only do partials. I think that would be like the next most novel step, is like literally just continuing the set and as your range of motion dropped off, so that you were at least adding some extra work. But if you think of it, like you're now only kind of working at we'll say a lower RIR or a higher RPE in that position for just a small portion of the set, right? Meaning that like, okay, so if you were to look at like a stimulating reps model or something, that'd be like, okay, we didn't spend a lot of time where that portion of the rep is really getting stimulated. So I would say, well, a better approach would be, instead of just doing that, would be to do something more drastic, which would be like the reverse drop set, which is where you actually grab a heavier load and then, basically move it as far as you can, but now the intensity is higher, right? Or you could take it a step further and be like, well, what if I just didn't do the full reps, or I did the full reps as a totally separate set? So I would do the partials in not a position of fatigue, so that I could actually get the highest amount of recruitment, right? So you'd be like, okay, maybe I do a couple sets of full range of motion, and then I do a couple sets of just very heavy partials, I don't know what the best order of those to be would, and all that stuff, like so many unknowns, but I'm just kind of looking at like, okay, well, how would we progress that? And then, well, switching to a cable, or maybe trying to lay somewhat sideways or turn your body so that now the load is just there. And I'm like, well, okay, now we can get that challenge in the lengthened position concentrically and eccentrically, and get more range of motion if we want. I don't know if that's better or worse, having that extra range of motion. It may be that like at a certain point, the extra range of motion isn't beneficial, or who knows, maybe it is like, hey, the top range of motion is actually better trained on its own in supplement to the bottoms. That way you can basically not have the fatigue of one position impacting the other. I don't know. This is why this is such an interesting time on the subject, because like I said, I look at that knee extension study and see the varied group, and I'm like, man, I wish they did this in all of the groups. I wish in all of these comparisons they didn't just do this or this, but they also did both. Because to me, that's what we're more likely to do in training, right? Like, are you going to just cut out all full range of motion exercises in your training? Probably not, right? Like, not very many people are going to be like, yeah, I'm just, is team half reps going to become a thing? Like,
Milo's TMing that.
I doubt it, right? Right. So I think, the more we can have applied research that is more representative to what we're actually going to do in the gym, the better. So I hope that we get more of that. Like, well, what if we do both, right? Instead of just I think that leg extension study is evidence that should be included, because it did, in that study, did seem to do better than the full ROM. So instead of just comparing lengthened partials to full ROM, I would like to see lengthened partial, full ROM, and then bottom half and top half kind of split in volume. And then if I'm thinking real world application, if I was focusing on hypertrophy, it probably wouldn't be a 50-50 split. Like the way that we do it now is like, if we're focusing on hypertrophy, it's probably going to be more like a 70-30 split.
Sure.
Meaning that it's like, okay, 70% of my exercises are going to focus on the lengthened position, and 30% of my volume is going to be on the short position. And then when we tend to focus on more body comp, we kind of flip that, because we can tolerate that volume with less fatigue when we kind of flip those two things and we're focusing more on short. and less on length. And since in that instance, we're not necessarily trying to grow muscle and the deficit as much as maintain it, it's like, well, are we getting sufficient mechanical tension in these exercises that, emphasize the short position with more of a metabolic impact and less fatigue? That has been my observation is like, look, I can get people to drop body fat, maintain muscle, actually stay fuller with less impact on their sleep and their digestion and their energy and all of that stuff by kind of flipping those ratios. And it's not like we're seeing people just lose all sorts of muscle. If anything, I feel like they actually keep it better. A lot of variables in there in terms of like, well, volume equating a short position versus a lengthened position. If you always fail in the short position first. So even if we equate like going to failure in both of those, it's not the same physiological failure. Like if you could reach failure in the short position of an exercise and likely just take that same weight and continue going in the lengthened position in pretty much most exercises. So it's not necessarily, even if you're taking those short positions to failure, it may be an equivalent lower RPE or higher RAR for lengthened positions. So like even though they're the same effort rating, it might be less volume or technically less further away from absolute physiological fatigue. So you add that on top of the stretch mediated mechanisms for fatigue, and it's like, okay, these are not apples to apples comparisons. So I think there's something to kind of shifting what you're doing relative towards what your goal is, and we've had good outcomes with that. Now I'm kind of lost in terms of where I was going with the topic there.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
It's interesting because, again, it just reminds me and I guess the audience as well in terms of when speaking about volume for hypertrophy. And obviously, I think at this point we're using number of hard sets quite often, like close sets to failure. But then when you throw this kind of information in the mix, like again, if someone's saying, oh, you need 10 to 20 sets to grow your quads, if you're doing all squats versus all leg extensions, again, that kind of goes into one being more lengthened, one being way more short in most cases. So it just throws another spanner in the mix and makes me think, what if we equate kind of like this stimulus type of thing? So maybe you do, if you're doing less lengthened work and you make up the difference through more short position work, so your total number of sets are higher, but overall you kind of the fatigue on the other side of the short kind of sets is lower as well. So you kind of get potentially the same outcome. I don't know. It kind of, that sort of idea is nice to me because it then kind of is like, so long as you're working hard enough and you're recovering on time with whatever you're doing, you're going to be growing very well. Well, that's probably true, but probably not the same though. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
In practice, like you know the kit that we have, right? So we can adjust range of motion, resistance profile on almost everything we have, right? Like I have equipment made specifically for that we've modified even further, like half the things in our HQ are the only one in existence. But so if I take, for instance, our leg extension, which I've modified to go even deeper into knee flexion than the factory settings, right? And then we can adjust the resistance profile. The amount of like sets to an equal amount of failure that I can tolerate by basically using the factory lengthened position and then setting the resistance challenge in the short position is probably at least 50% more volume than I can tolerate than if I set it super deep and then make that challenge more towards the bottom. And I mean, I noticed this across a whole bunch of exercises, but I use that example because I can keep that exercise literally the exact same thing. The only thing that's changing is, well, in one instance, I'm getting a little bit longer muscle length with a little bit more load towards the bottom, and the other, it's a little, and the challenges is more towards the top. And that difference alone in a movement that is nearly identical as you probably could get, like, for that type of comparison. I can tolerate probably about 50% with the same amount of relative fatigue being not just soreness, but also basically how soon I can come back and repeat that performance, which I think that's really the best proxy we have for fatigue. It's not like, well, how sore I am or how pumped. And it's like, when can you go back and, repeat or progressively overload that performance? Like, because that's what you're looking for in recovery, right? Is return to performance, not return to, being able to sit on the toilet without it hurting or whatever. Like, I mean, it's not that those things don't probably have some correlation to these things. I just think the thing that really matters is like, hey, has the muscle gotten to the point now where it can do that same amount of work, produce that same amount of force or more? That's when you can qualify as like fatigue has dissipated, recovery and adaptation has occurred.
I think that might be the like objective or the like literature based or the sports science based terminology for like, this is objective recovery, is when you can kind of get that performance back, which makes a lot of sense also because sometimes you have people who are sore, or I've had that instances where I'm sore but I can still perform okay, so I'm not of a level of soreness that means I can't perform. So that's interesting. And actually something I've thought about for a while is obviously you mentioned the Prime kit and how you can manipulate kind of where it makes, I guess you can manipulate again if it's a kind of hardest in the lengthened position, short and mid. Do you think Prime would ever be interested in kind of doing own like studies on their own kit? Because that would kind of solve your issue there, because you'd know exactly the piece of kit, where they're loading it, everything. That sounds like something we need to get done.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I know a few years back they did hire somebody to do it. I just don't know. Like, we'll put it this way: I don't think it doesn't make financial sense, because I don't think it would move the needle.
Yeah.
For them. I mean, would they do it out of pure intellectual curiosity? Maybe, right? But being, intimately familiar with it, like, they're not short of wanting customers, right? Like right now, in terms of like, yeah, like if you're going to buy a piece of Prime equipment, it's not like just sitting there. Like the demand is already high. This is the reason that I can't get all the new things done that I want. Like, so if you guys would just stop buying equipment so they could just focus on building stuff for me, that would be great. Now, no, by all means, like, I think for the majority of machines, the stuff they make is about the best option you could get. But I just, that's probably something that we would have to do. And I mean, to be honest, like, you do, like, even though the Prime machines would probably be the best to do it, because you could literally use the same machine and then just adjust the profile or whatever. They're not like, every machine does have a resistance profile, right? So simply just being able to, if we just had that data in the current research, like, so anybody that knows somebody that published a study on any of these things, if they could just, snap a picture of the machine that they use, or just let us know what it is, or like, I mean, the tricep studies, like, hey, just tell us where that cable was. Like, man, to me, that would add so much valuable context to the research that we already have. But yeah, I'd love to see them do that. I think that's one of the areas where, like, there's been, I think, 2 attempts now where, like, they've just been like, hey, what if we compare an exercise that matches the strength curve versus an exercise that doesn't? And what if the benefit, and this is something I've always kind of been in conflict with, some of the people from like RTS and Tom Purvis said, like, well, the best exercises, we have to match the strength profile and the resistance profile, like they should match. And I'm like, okay, if you look at like a single repetition and you could only do one, like, and that's all you got, it's like, well, yeah, probably would make sense that you'd want it to be challenging through the whole range. But in practice, what I have found is that, one, that's just impossible, because as a human, your strength curve actually changes every rep. So if you were to do an isokinetic machine dynamometer type thing, you would see that how much force you produce throughout the range of motion changes, and you get increasingly weaker in the short position every repetition that you do, and the more fatigue that you accumulate. So it's like, well, okay, what do you do? Do you match the strength curve to the first rep, or to what you think is going to be the last rep, or somewhere in the middle? And so that's why I've usually said, it's like, look, you probably just don't want to have a resistance profile in, like, if you only have one exercise, you probably just want it to be so that there's like no dead zones, right? Like no part of the exercise is basically a rest, right? Or if it is, you just don't want, you want to account for that, right? Like, take a squat, for example. If one week you decide that you're going to stop and take 2 breaths to the top of every one, and then you just basically just go up and down the next week, you might be like, oh man, I must be wrecked because my performance really dropped. So it's like, well, if you do have points of low tension, spending time there probably actually will influence like your way of tracking progressive overload more than if there's some inconsistency during the actual, like, concentric and eccentric phase or whatnot, right? Same thing where, like, well, okay, if you stop and pause at the hardest part, that's also going to have an impact, but in the opposite direction. So I think that if we actually looked at saying, hey, for hypertrophy, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we choose a position that accentuates the muscle length that we're trying to bias, that we might see a signal. But when we're just saying, hey, what if we have exercises? Because most exercises that are not set up to balance the strength curve are already somewhat lengthened bias, when we're talking about free weight movements or machines, right? Yeah. All of your upper body pressing, pretty much every lower body squatting pattern is already challenging the lengthened position. So really what we're seeing potentially in those studies is that, look, getting, the whole strength curve is not significantly better than having adequate resistance in the lengthened when it comes to a hypertrophy outcome. But what we haven't seen is, well, what if we took those exercises that don't naturally kind of have that, like the lats, for example, right? So if they because the most of the things they did was like, they'd like elbow flexion and tricep, they'd basically just do the hinge joints, right? Like it's either elbow or knee. The unfortunate thing is that the things that people are most curious about are the complex muscles, like the glutes and the lats and things. And the research is just like, oh no, that's going to be hard. I mean, I'm not saying that like it's in like, oh, but I do see where they're like, yeah, well, let's just do the elbow flexion thing, because that study design is going to be so much easier, right? And it's going to be so much easier to get consistency amongst these novice college students that are coming in to do these exercises or whatnot, right? I could just imagine what Chris Bearcat's going to go through because he's doing the study on the different pull downs and whatnot. And it's like, all right,
is he?
This is cool. Is this like,
nice?
Yeah. So he's going to measure the frontal plane pull in versus the sagittal plane pull down. And I think he wants to then maybe, like, depending on how that goes, like actually then look at a pull around later. And I'm like, nice. All right, that's going to be a challenge because you're going to have to get those people competent at an exercise that requires a lot more skill than just, hey, you're stuck in this machine, now just flex your elbow and now just extend your elbow, right? I mean, even a squatting pattern, you could argue, is like, well, for a person that doesn't train, squatting is still more of an organic movement to a human body, right? Than a dumbbell press or a pull around or a pull, like any of these things where it's like, okay, people, this is going to be a very foreign motion to them. And now we're asking them to do that, with effort and load. So that's a we'll say it's a more challenging objective to achieve. But I think that if they did the studies on things like lats and they compared conventional exercises to then being able to use a piece of kit like Prime, where you could overload the lengthened position, right? Or even better, do it like we're doing it, where it's like, okay, you're doing a pull around and you have the thing loading in the lengthened position. If you add that, man, that's probably going to really be, I would say, a much stronger hypertrophy stimulus. right? That's kind of what I've observed. I think that's one of the reasons that back training is so popular for us is that it's one of the places where when people apply some of our nuances, that there is a very observable difference for them, like in the real world, right? Yeah. But if when I coach people, I'm like, hey, here's a better way to set up for a dumbbell press. The dumbbell press that they were doing was already checking a lot of the boxes for being effective because it was already a fairly stretched position. It was already overload and length of position. So maybe I'm able to help them target the part of the pec they want a little bit more. Maybe I'm able to help them, save their shoulders a little bit more. Maybe I'm able to help them like manage the fatigue to be where they want it, and it's not, in their elbows or whatever, or just simply allow them to choose better exercise, complementary exercises and programming and stuff by being able to refine technique. But it's not going to have as big of a difference because it's not as big of a change in stimulus compared to somebody that was like, okay, well, I was doing pull downs, but there was only the short position, right? The overload was there, and I had all these opportunities for technique improvement, right? So it's like, okay, man, we can literally, there's room for improvement across the board now, right? And so now it doesn't take a very long period of time for somebody to have like a visible difference or a huge change in the rate of which they're progressively overloading that tissue when the magnitude of the stimulus has changed that much, But, if I take people and I'm like, hey, you had a pretty good squat, but, we could make it a little bit more quad dominant with some heel elevation or whatnot. Okay, cool. You take a person that has a like terrible quad squat, like it's a good morning Lane Norton-y looking like squat thing, and all of a sudden you throw them on a pendulum, a hack, or you teach them how to use a very like high heel elevated like think board, they would experience a similar thing, like, oh my god, my quads are now starting to grow. It's a completely different experience. So I think that we've had that pretty much across the board with lats, like for almost everybody that does it, because you are limited to the exercise. Like you can't just walk into a gym and just, oh, look at all this equipment that loads the lats in the lengthened position. Even if you have, hammer strength or whatever, it's like, well, you're not going to, the picture that's on the machine, that's probably not how you're going to use it. If you want to train it the way we, like, you're going to step back, or you're going to be turned around, or you're going to throw some handles on there and do all sorts of stuff. Right. You're going to get that, you're going to get that look from the old people at the gym that are just like, what are you doing over there? Again, it's like, don't mind me setting up my little erector set over here to train my iliac division to the lat. Trust me, it's optimal. But I think that we would see those differences there if we were actually looking at the exercises where there was a relative magnitude of change, rather than the exercises where we're really not changing the magnitude that much difference, because the resistance profile or the range of motion was already very close to those conditions to begin with.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And actually it makes a ton of sense to why your back stuff has become so popular versus like chest or quads or whatever, because a lot of those movements already were doing a pretty good job. But I can even speak to, for a long time, kind of putting back squats on like a pedestal, but I am very kind of glute dominant, and they were great for growing my glutes, But as I kind of transition more towards using machines and like whatever I have access to, and really trying to like get them to be more quad dominant, focusing on that knee flexion, like I saw a big change there. And my approach to back training has definitely changed as well, where I used to just have this perspective like, oh, horizontal and vertical pulling, and that's like your back covered. And I mean, in some instances for a lot of people, like, that could be fine, but kind of thinking a little bit more about kind of where you're pulling your elbow and hand positions and torso positions and that sort of thing has definitely been helpful. And I guess a lot of, like, to bring it back to a point you made before, where kind of a lot of people have been kind of gravitated to exercises that are kind of seeing and researched to be quite hypertrophic, is like the way a lot of old school bodybuilders like row or pull was very much like momentum driven in that kind of lengthened position to get into the short position, or even doing dumbbell lateral raises, like that kind of using that momentum kind of got like poo-pooed on, or even for pulling. And I think there is like a sweet spot here. I don't think you should just be swinging things around like you mentioned, but if you completely approach your kind of back motions to how you approach your chest, I could see how someone would really carefully kind of pull it down, and they're really weak in this short position, and then they're failing way sooner than they necessarily should be. Whereas if they're a bit explosive in that pulling motion at the start, and then get it down a little bit. I'm just kind of spitballing, but yeah, it's interesting to see it in practice and then coming to fruition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always find it interesting to look and see how many people have been unconsciously kind of like trying, like it's like intuitively they're trying to find the solution. You can see it in either the exercise they're choosing or the technique that they're using. Like I think every influencer in like 2021 made a video that the narrow the V handlebar was
I just watched your video today
trash, right
on that.
So it's like it's like these ideas of like, well, no, not really. Like, oh, just because Arnold or Ronnie did it doesn't mean it's good. And I'm like, well, honestly, they probably felt a better stretch when they were doing that, right? It's not as good for the short position, but I doubt, I mean, I've watched a lot of Arnold and Ronnie videos, and I've never heard them say, well, I chose this exercise because it really allows me to get to that, fully short contracted position, or like nothing like that. But in them seeking training, like, and finding exercises that either help them, feel the stretch more, they had more disruption, or just anecdotally they noticed that all of a sudden there seemed to be a change in their progress. So if you see like that iconic like seated row with the little V handle where like they're leaning, like they're letting it pull them forward and whatnot with a little bit of a momentum, it's like, okay, I look at that and I'm like, okay, maybe that's all ego. Maybe they're just like, hey, I can throw more weight on the stack there. Or maybe what eventually got them to that technique is they're like, well, this handle, I feel a little bit better stretch. All right, well, if I lean into it, I get a little bit more. Well, actually, if I kind of let this there, like let it fall forward a little bit, and I get that, I really feel it kind of pull on me in that position or whatever. And that seems like those small little details kind of added up and eventually you had that. Now, today we have more information. We have a better understanding of how muscles work, biomechanics, and all this. We can come up with better solutions than just using a tiny little handle and momentum. We can solve these problems through better setups and engineering and using different pieces of equipment. And I think that's a safer and more effective way to do it. But I also think that it's cool to see that and also have the correlation of like, people tend to be like, well, no, like bodybuilders haven't been doing this, optimal training or these advanced techniques. And I'm like, I don't think you pay enough attention to watching bodybuilders train.
Sure.
Because they might not be speaking of it scientifically, but they're being meticulous in the things that they're doing, right? It's just people they're looking at it through like, well, they're not solving the problem the same way that I'm solving the problem. Therefore, what they're doing is just bro nonsense. And I'm like, no, like a lot of these people were trying to get to the same destination that, maybe we are in the published research now. Like, well, okay, all of a sudden right now, stretch-made hypertrophy is popular, but I mean, we've been applying this stuff for a long period of time simply because like, well, mechanistically, it seems to make sense. Observationally, it seems to work. But I'm not up on a podium being like, hey, this is the way it is. It's not until we have, peer-reviewed research that we tend to like all of a sudden now it's okay to like have a stronger opinion about the idea. And then some people take that the other direction and like, one piece of, research like has one sentence that works in their favor. And then they're like,
yeah,
like
big cherry picking.
The way it is. Yeah. But I think that the observational data and the anecdotes for this stuff have been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
And if you just take the look, you can see this stuff being applied. And we don't know. Like I said, some of these things could just be ego, but you being, a bodybuilder yourself, I think with the population that I've worked with, we'll put it this way. I've worked with a ton of competitors. They're narcissists, but their ego when it comes to training is not about, hey, I want to move this weight or I want to do this thing. Like literally, right? Like they would do the most ridiculous thing in the gym that they thought was the stupidest, dumbest looking, whatever, if they felt it was actually going to give them a better outcome, right? So when people are like, oh, they're just ego lifting, I'm like, anybody with a physique thing, their ego is relative to the outcome of that exercise, not not like how much load it's, I mean, some people like to be strong and move heavy weights or whatnot, but I don't think it really ever gets to the point. Like it's a very, very small minority of people that were successful in bodybuilding that could just, push for weights. Cause usually that works itself out. Either either you just don't end up with the best physique or you just end up with loads of injuries and you're just never going to make it to that level. Right. You look at some of the you look at the biggest weight slingers and in bodybuilding, and a lot of them have a lot of injuries, right? And
Sure.
that's the small minority. The majority of bodybuilders, especially good bodybuilders, you don't see them moving powerlifting weight, right? You see them, I mean, they're huge humans, right? With just a little bit of blood in their testosterone, right? Is the way I like to put it, right? So sure, when you see them throwing, like 6 plates on a hammer strength machine, you're like, oh my God. But you also have to remember that, like, look, that dude's chest is like the size of your torso. Yeah. So that 6 plates proportionate to the size of their body is not ego lifting. That's just appropriate loading, for their tissue. And what they're doing usually is intentful, I would say, on scale, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I don't like putting a label of like, well, this is just something the bros do. And I'm like, well, which bros are we talking about here, right? Because if we're looking at the people that have managed to stay in the industry and compete in that sport for years and years and years, those are the people usually that there's a tremendous amount of intent to their training. And if you can look at it through the lens of what they're doing, you'll probably see that they're finding solutions, moving them towards the same goal that we're trying to do on the more scientific end, right? It may not be the same, but it's moving in the same direction.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well said. And I always think about it. A common one that we get at least is kind of the failure camp versus not failure. It's like, people, for every person you can say train to failure, you can pick out someone else who didn't. Like, have you watched them train? Are you with them when they're doing all their training? Like, it's just one of those kind of tit for tat things. And I think it's the same way here, where people just see like one clip of Ronnie Coleman like deadlifting or squatting, and they're like, oh, bodybuilders just train for like heavy lifting and ego or whatever. But I thought the V-bar was a great example of this kind of perspective on at least the way I had seen it. And I'd even been influenced by this on social media, where I was like, I can't row or pull down with a V-bar. Like, I'm going to be internally rotated. I can't get into this like full short position like you said. And then I tried it today after watching your video where it explained, well, as your hands are closer together, you're going to get more of a stretch across the lats. And it's only when you get short that maybe it's not the best kind of handle to use. So I tried like a length and partial on the neutral grip row with this closer grip. And actually it was like a mag grip that was like angled out here. And I was like, wow, that felt great. Like, that felt really good. Which brings me to a question actually for you, Kass. You'll probably be familiar with the kind of stimulus fatigue ratio that Mike Israetel popularized. And that is something I use to guide quite a few training decisions in terms of even exercise selection, where I'm looking at the target muscle. Did it get a good pump? Did it get good kind of disruption, potentially soreness, fatigue, without kind of the unwanted kind of joint fatigue, connective tissue fatigue? And that can help me guide various decisions, and one being exercise selection. Is that something you think has lots of value? And do you help it in deciding kind of exercise selection on your end? Does it inform anything for you? I'd be interested.
I would say, with the nuance that we apply to exercise selection, is that we're fairly good at predicting what the SFR of a given exercise is going to be. I mean, that to me, that's what's valuable about knowing the qualities of an exercise, from its range of motion, its resistance profile, from which tissue that it's, going to target more, and the complexity, et cetera, is that, okay, I know that this exercise here, right, has these qualities, and therefore it's likely going to have this type of disruption, this type of soreness. And so then I can gauge a person's response to that on scale. So for instance, if I took a short and a long exercise, right, and I had you do both of those, and it was like, okay, do this many sets and do this many sets the other one. If I didn't know anything about that, I would just assume that, like, okay, this exercise is way more fatiguing, and this exercise is not that fatiguing. And if they're both giving you good pumps, then I might be like, well, just do the short position exercise, because, we can tolerate that volume. You seem to recover from it better. You're getting great pumps, et cetera, and that could be the total wrong decision in that course. So I do look at that, but I look at it through the lens of what is the expected outcome for that type of motion, right? Like if somebody does RDLs, I expect them to have a certain amount of disruption, being in that lengthened position. So I don't look at it as like, okay, well, I'm going into this, but I will take into account how novel that motion is for somebody, right? How big and how strong they are and whatever and whatnot. And then be like, so what is likely an appropriate volume? And then how can I adjust my split to accommodate those? So if I'm going to use a higher volume of lengthened exercises, I'm automatically going to set my split to allow for a longer period of recovery time, right? Because even if I know like, well, hey, if we get the volume perfectly, this is going to be recovered in this amount. But I also know that like, if we get it off a little bit and I have this other, like, we'll say it's a 24, 48 hour buffer window, I know by then, even if we have a day where we blow past our RPE goals, or we're a little more stressed, a little whatever it is like we still have that like, okay, we're gonna be recovered. We should be at that point where we can perform, right? I can now set realistic expectations for, okay, if we're doing here, we should be able to apply progressive overload here. And knowing now the conditions of that, I can look at the SFR specific to the qualities of that exercise, right? Through a means of not just how sore and whatever you are, but whether or not we are actually progressing along the timeline that would be appropriate for that type of stress. And then I can adjust the volume accordingly. Because now I know that if we're not progressing in that time frame, that either the exercise like is too novel or too advanced for that person at that point in time relative to the amount of volume or whatever. And I can adjust that equation appropriately, right? So I can be like, okay, we weren't ready for lengthened partials yet, or that's too many sets, right? Or whatever it may be that we need to adjust about that, right? And the other thing is taking into context the novelty of it. So basically, like, well, where are you coming from, right? It's a new meso. Where are you coming from? Because there's going to be a big difference between coming in and you were like, okay, you were doing pendulums, full knee flexion or whatever, and now we're going into deep hack squats. I'm like, well, okay, that's going to be very different than somebody that was doing, they were doing barbell squats and they weren't able to quite get full knee flexion. And now we're working into an exercise where all of a sudden now they're getting a much greater range of motion in a more biased loading pattern than they had before, right? So the novelty is a big difference. So I'm going to have my volume and expectations of soreness and disruption or whatever calibrated to, well, how novel is the stimulus in range of motion, loading, complexity, skill, et cetera. So we do use it, but I would say we use it more in a proactive manner than a reactive. It's a proactive manner with a reactive contingency rather than just, hey, try this exercise and then based off of disruption, like either change exercise or, do your volume. I think you could make a lot of poor exercise selection decisions if you don't kind of calibrate what the expectation should be for that exercise, right? And I think the tendency that people could have is consistently going back to exercises that they're either more familiar or more coordinated to, because every time they go into the novelty box, right, now is the SFR of this worse, right? And it's such a subjective thing because, well, how do you judge the S part of the SFR? To me, that's the biggest, like, how do you quantify that, right? Because that's also going to be like, because if an exercise is more novel, well, your progressive overload, if that's how you're quantifying the stimulus, well, it's going to be much higher because your coordination improvement is going to be leading to a huge portion of that progressive overload potential, right? Versus actual creation of accumulated tissue or improvement in motor unit recruitment, which is going to come slower in an exercise that you already have a decent coordination and skill in. So in principle, yes. In practice, I don't like that to be the first thing that we're choosing to base our interventions off of, because one, it's so subjective, and two, you kind of have to calibrate it to each scale. So my approach is have as much information about what the client's been doing and know as much as you can about the quality of these exercises so that your expectations can be very calibrated on that, and less of your decisions will be made on the things that are much more subjective.
Yeah.
In that case, right? So, I mean, coaching really comes down to setting appropriate expectations and then tracking to see if you're meeting them. I mean, across the board, like if you apply that principle to everything of like, hey, how can I most accurately set the expectations, whether it's for how you're setting your calorie deficit or whatever it may be, and then tracking how close you are to meeting, exceeding, or falling short of those expectations, and then being able to make smart adjustments from that, like the problem solving portion of that. So if you do that through SFR, great. It probably just depends on how good you are at actually observing what the stimulus of this is and understanding what things would make that artificially be higher or lower, right? Like if you can manage the expectation of what the stimulus should be and what the fatigue should be for this exercise in the timeline of which you are using it, right? Because the expectation is going to be different in the first 3 weeks of a meso than it is going to be the last 3 weeks of a meso, right? So as long as you maintain that calibration, I think an intuitive bodybuilder could, can use that as a guideline. But I think if you don't calibrate those expectations, you could just be going all over the place, or just potentially you could be making poor exercise selection choices or poor volume choices simply just because you haven't calibrated that equation to what is actually meaningful for the stimulus. You could just be, you're following symptoms, not necessarily the path to the best results, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Even down like the expectations of, something higher rep is more likely to give you a bigger pump versus something lower rep is probably going to be maybe more disruption based, more just tension and fatigue that you're going to feel. And then, like you said, if you introduce a new movement, you don't want to just completely write it off immediately. Like if it on principle makes complete sense, like give it a chance, see how you're going with it. Overall progressive overload, like you mentioned, is like, that's the most important kind of factor of all of it. And then there's even like some muscles like your quads and chest get a crazy pump, whereas your back never quite gets that like huge pumped feeling like your chest does, or your hamstrings. They kind of just feel like tight and like they're going to cramp, versus like a quad that feels like full of blood. So there's all those kind of individual differences as well. So yeah, I definitely think, like you said, not kind of pinning everything on that, and you need to have quite a good understanding of it. I think as an advanced bodybuilder, hopefully you kind of do, because maybe you can intuit some of these things that you mentioned. And one of the reasons I brought it up was that kind of, obviously you have that saying, pull around and find out. And I think some people are kind of afraid to try new things if there's like no confirmed, I don't know, science or data, or it just, I don't know, doesn't make sense to them, or someone else has said like, I don't know, the pull around is just a waste of time. And that's why I really liked that phrasing, because I was like, people just need to like sometimes try things. Obviously don't try new things all the time and throughout like your current programming, but I mean, you could be missing out on something if you, like you said, pull around and find out. So I wonder if part of my buy-in to the pull around is like trying out, feeling this kind of SFR type of deal. And obviously also the explanation on paper of the lats being around the rib cage and getting more lengthened position, that also sells me on it initially. Like you don't want to just try something that's complete garbage. But that's kind of where that question came from.
I think it's funny because if you think the nuances don't matter, then you should just be able to like, well, why can't you do these other exercises? Because they should all be very similar in benefit, right? So you shouldn't be afraid to try them out. If you do think the nuances matter, most of these things make a lot of sense from a mechanistic and a technical perspective, even if we don't have the applied research, right? Like, okay, well, I find it very hard to make an argument that the pull around is not a longer lat. Like you could literally feel it going around your body and stretching, despite what some people want to argue. But so it's like, okay, I think like no matter where you sit on the spectrum, you either shouldn't have the fear of trying things because you basically are the mindset that, look, all of these exercises, if I apply progressive overload and consistency, they're going to be effective. Or, man, these nuances can really make a difference. Pretty much like everything that we put out is going to have a pretty strong like logic behind it from a biomechanics perspective. And, like very few people are aware of how much detail goes into this stuff. Like before you see something on social media or whatnot, like when I started doing the press rounds, I just decided like, hey, I'm just gonna start posting this stuff as I'm playing around with it and training. And everybody kept being like, when are you going to add the explanation and all the details and the press rounds in our, in our exercise library, whatever? Because usually even then we have like, hey, here's the detailed or whatever. And I'm like, right now we're just referencing these posts that I'm trying, because right now I don't have like, hey, here's the best way to do it, right? And same thing for these programs. So you can kind of see like, we'll start doing something. I'm like, okay, there's a principle we're going after, but it's like, well, okay, well, for the clavicular pec, should it be coming up in this way or should it be coming around this way? Well, that one doesn't have as much scapular motion, so should we be pushing through? Or like, man, there's so many of these details to work out, right? Which means one, we have to look at them from a mechanical modeling perspective, do all the physics, and then it's like, all right, well, can we get some data on EMG that correlates with that? Can we get some data on the Moxie that correlates that? What about just the mere practicality of the exercises, right? And sometimes we'll come with an exercise that's like, okay, this is great, but I'm never going to show anybody that because I'm going to get laughed out of the room because, I've done this elaborate setup. And it's like, look, the only person that's practically going to be able to do this is me, because I have my own HQ with all of this stuff. So I'm not going to share that until I can come up with an example that is feasible for everybody to do. Otherwise, the initial reaction is going to be like, oh, this is too complex. This is too much time, blah, blah, blah. Like, as soon as you give somebody a reason not to do something, I think that's when they're immediately going to not try it. And so that's, for anybody that is like trying to push out something, you have a great idea about an exercise or whatever, that would be like my piece of advice is, one, provide as much evidence for why this might be a good idea as you can, but two, don't be in a rush, because like a lot of times people, like as soon as they come up with an idea of like, hey, here's something I'm trying, like it's immediately going on Instagram right away. And I think what happens is the newness and the novelty will then sometimes make that first version go viral. And I wish that I could go back and like, okay, single arm pull downs, kneeling on the floor or whatever, by far not the best exercise, right? But one guy with 3 million followers on TikTok decides that that's going to be the exercise that he decides to popularize. And now everybody's like, oh, this is the thing. And I'm like, okay. And six months later, we had just like okay, now we have this for all of the divisions, much better stretches, all this other stuff. But what the world knows this exercise is like, hey, one day Kass walked into the gym, the machine he was taking was, or the machine he wanted was taken. So he was like, well, I'm just going to go and grab on this pulley and see if I can come up with a solution. And that's the thing that's in the ether now, right? So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to try things. But also like, if you're on my side of the equation, right? Or even if you're just playing around with yourself or whatnot, man, give yourself a little bit of evaluation time, tinker around, because odds are if somebody else is experimenting and then you're experimenting with their experiment, and then maybe somebody's experimenting with your experiment of that experiment, right? Like, what you're trying to do is get everybody as close to doing the most ideal version of that as possible. And I wish social media worked as an ecosystem where it's like, hey, everybody's trying this out and sharing their ideas on how to make it better. But that's not how it is. Everybody's like, oh, that thing he's doing is fucking stupid. You should do it this way or what, and it just goes around in a circle until we eventually get back to doing the same thing, and everything else that everybody else did was stupid, and we're back to the same spot. And it's like, okay, that's not helpful. So anyway, ramble.
Well said. I think that was a good run. One quick thing on the pull around. As I said, I was experimenting after seeing the footage you sent across. And have you noticed anyone get very sore rear delts from it? Because that's what happened to me. I was trying the motions and I've had sore rear delts for like 2 or 3 days now. And I'm like, And I guess it is similar to some of the kind of like the reverse fly motions you might do in a really biased lengthened position for the rear delt. But yeah, both my rear delts just are completely lit up.
So I think most people, like a lengthened rear delt is probably a very novel stimulus. I have not put out on social any of our lengthened delt exercises. And it's because there's a lot more delts than 3. And I just don't know how I want to communicate that to the world.
It's too much, Kass.
Yes.
3 was enough.
So, yeah. But so for instance, the thoracic pull around, because you're getting into full shoulder adduction, right? Like if you like, cause I mean, what have been the rear delt exercises in your repertoire before trying these? Have you had anything that was actually pulling your arm all the way across your, but like into full adduction, or have they been like rows and, you know, reverse flies and things like, so
I was doing that reverse fly for a little bit, and it got me really sore when I started doing it, and then I dropped rear delt work. So I just had, because I just decided I didn't need that volume, that extra volume. I could put it elsewhere. So not for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So odds are, even though these aren't necessarily direct, like rear delt motions, that this is a muscle length that is completely novel in those things, right? So like you could look at a similar example of being like, you know, say somebody had never done like a low cable curl with their arm behind. Like if it was somebody that had never done any lengthened anterior delt work, they might actually experience some soreness doing that initially, because that would like when a stimulus is very, very novel, it does not take a lot to have that initial disruption, right?
Yeah.
But what you should see is that dissipates over the course of a few weeks, and then that no longer is becoming the limiter because the load is primary where you have it. If it stayed there, then I'd say, okay, there's probably something with the technique that, because I mean, in these positions, like if you are setting up the resistance to being too, we'll say, abduction or shoulder extension biased in the lengthened position, you are going to bias the short elbow extensors, which are going to be like the delts and the teres. But actually, like, so if you notice in like most of these setups, the force in terms of like trying to flex the shoulder it's not a lot. Like if we use the moment arm, like the moment arm on those is not huge in the lengthened position, because most of the stress we're trying to put on the lats in that stretch is actually from the sternoclavicular joint, right? So potentially you could be overloading the shoulder joint with either the direction that you have the cable or the intention of what you're trying to do the movement. And if anything, the lengthened position you should think of it as like that very end is a little bit more, say, scapular motion biased, right? So potentially a better partial in those lengthened positions, that might be one of the few areas where you could kind of just do the scapular motion. Like you could get into one of these and just do either the retraction, depression, or hybrid of that motion. I don't think that is a good way to initiate a full rep, right? To like do the scapular movement and then do shoulder extension. I think that completely destroys trying to do the full rep in terms of a mechanics and leverages standpoint. But I think if you were going to just do like the lengthened partials, one thing could be is if you're getting into these positions and then you're doing the lengthened partial as glenohumeral motion, you like in that I think I included the ones where I had Brian in there. When he did the partial, I had him do the partial as just the scapular thoracic motion.
Yeah.
Right. That was a big change that we made. And I think that's going to be a huge improvement for those motions. This is one of the reasons, like, I want to, I wish I could have had this conversation with Milo and Dr. Pack before they started. It's like, hey, when you do these lengthened partials, we should look at what would actually be the best way for that muscle to do the lengthened partial, but it may be too much of a deviation from the other exercise to at least get the initial results they're looking for. But with such a big study, it's like, man, it'd be really nice if we had all these small details. If we're gonna have, 50 to 100 data points, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking with that study as well, you mentioned wanting to know the machines within individual studies, and now you've got all these participants in different gyms all over the place using different machines, which obviously it just like, it's a variable that you have to just consider. And obviously, I think the literature, well, it depends what, the literature normally comes from an exercise perspective, whereas you virtually always come from a muscle perspective in terms of like a lengthened muscle versus a lengthened exercise, if that makes sense. So it makes sense that your thought process is a little bit different to maybe how they've kind of designed that, but hopefully still very, very useful.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, when it comes to what's going to impact hypertrophy, it's like, well, it has to be what happens physiologically. And so I think those are the conditions that we should be standardizing things to. But it's a different knowledge bracket to like, no, like as far as I know, outside of what we teach, I don't think there's a consolidated thing of like, hey, here's the fully shortened and fully lengthened positions for these muscles, right? So they would basically have to they would have to establish those positions on their own ahead of that, right? So, maybe one day we'll get to the point where this information could be, quote unquote textbook, right? Of like, oh, this is how you would fully lengthen this, and this is how you would fully shorten this, and that can then be part of the standardization of like, all right, well, this is about a 90% lengthened whatever lat for this exercise. And so we're going to look at it through the lens of not that, hey, this is fully lengthened, right? Or this is a lengthened partial. It's like, well, this is a partial that, works whatever from, 60% to 90% of the muscle's length.
Yeah.
Right. I think physiologically that's the lens that we need to have to start kind of uncoupling the mechanisms. Sure. Because if the exercises are at all random physiological lengths, then it's like, okay, one, the signal is going to have to be really, really strong to buffer out those exercises that aren't as long, if that's a factor, right? Like, because if you have some exercise where it's like they're doing a lengthened partial, but physiologically it's a mid-range partial, right? And like that's probably going to lower the amplitude of the signal of the exercises that are actually closer to full length, if we're like kind of looking this, more of a, a general view, or looking across all of the exercises and trying to uncover this as a principle, is that the physiological response becomes less. We're not looking at it accurately in that lens. So I hope when they break down their data that they do it specific to each exercise as well as overall, because then at least we could go in and be like, all right, in principle, these exercises tend not to be as physiologically long. And then we'd be able to look at that as like, is there a signal that the exercises that are more physiologically lengthened had a better, magnitude of difference than those that were less? Like, because that would be, because one of the questions I have is, how long does it have to be? And where's the cutoff for that? Like, I had this conversation with Mike on the hack squat, right? When we're talking about band versus not band.
Yeah.
I can't remember how long ago that podcast was, like a year and a half ago or something. And my theories is like, look, I think this is going to function on a gradient because the exercises that we're looking at, most of them aren't at absolute physiological lengths. Like none of the preacher curl studies are a physiologically lengthened bicep, right? I mean, is the bottom of a preacher curl on the lengthened half? Yes. But is it, all the way lengthened? No, you can easily get like from that position here, we could probably lengthen the bicep another 30% change in its total distance, right? Not 30% longer muscle, but 30% change in the total length change that it goes from short to long. No, I don't think we have any muscles where we shorten them 30% of their, probably some, but random nerd thought. That's what happens. But I think that it would be great from a coach's and an in-practice perspective to know, well, how close to the physiological length do I need to be, right? And the same thing is, it's like, how aggressive does the resistance need to be in terms of getting there, right? Can it just be like, hey, it's linear, or does it actually have to somewhat increase as you're going through that eccentric and lengthening, right? Do you need that, like, do we need that the resistance challenge is proportionally going up as the passive components are starting to add to really maximize the benefit? Or is that a wash if we're training these positions close enough to failure? Right? Like those are all like the little nuances where I'm looking at, it's like, okay, being somebody on a coach and teaching, teaching coaches, those are the things that like can really help me with decision-making processes of, here's this exercise, or here's how I'd modify this exercise. Here's the way that I would choose to go after that lengthened position, whether it would be on its own, on its partial, whatever it would be.
I guess, was there an example with the leg curl study where the seated leg curl hypertrophied the hamstrings more, but the lying leg curl, the sartorius, grew more? And was that related to the sartorius being at a longer muscle length, and that's why they saw that difference. I don't know if you know that one.
Yeah, that would be the most sensical hypothesis.
Yeah.
In that, right, with those two setups, right? Because the sartorius crosses the hip, and it attaches much in the same way that the rec fem does, right? So when you're straightening the leg, you're gonna lengthen that, right? So that would seem to correlate, but again, like when we're looking at there, so what we don't like, what would be interesting to know is, like, what if we had a seated leg curl where they leaned back, as so like something in the middle, right?
Right.
And because then it would be like, well, if I smashed more sets of that, would that get me would that get me equal hamstring and like where's the portion of that? So that, like, those are the thresholds of what I'm looking at. Because right now, yeah, it does seem to be like, all right, towards the lengthened position is what it seems to be better, and we need to have a certain amount of resistance there. So it's like I can take those two principles and apply them now, but I don't have a cutoffs, right? So I'm making judgment calls in terms of like, well, okay, do pull arounds need to be a thing?
Yeah.
I mean, we're going more length than pretty much every piece of data in the research that we have right now. A pull around is a greater physiological length of the lats than what these studies are going to, right? I mean, who knows? Could there be a paradoxical impact where, well, we need to be longer, but all the way long somehow is worse, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I don't know. Anecdotally, it seems as though that there's not necessarily a downside, especially like once you're a few weeks into the exercise, you get the repeated bout effect, et cetera. Like, it seems to be like, okay, we're good there. But I would love to have like a little bit tighter principles in terms of like how to apply this stuff from a coaching perspective. And we'll get there, but probably not for 3-5 years, something like that is when we'll kind of get there. Like, at least from a research perspective, observationally, I'm already kind of, I'm experimenting with this stuff, and we're having all, the nice thing about having, thousands of students and coaches that are applying this stuff is we can be like, all right, here's kind of how we're thinking this. And, that then gets applied on scale to, tens of thousands of clients. And obviously we get feedback, right? Like, when we put out something and all of a sudden it's making a huge difference for everybody's clients, we get it's not necessarily scientific, but, we know when we're getting great feedback from our coaches that, hey, this is benefiting. Versus if we throw out a dud, usually what happens is we start getting a lot of questions because people assume that, like, oh, I'm not sure I'm doing this right or whatever. And I'm like, all right, well, either we don't have a good explanation for that, or this is not actually a good solution for that, or it's not having the desired impact on scale. It may have had it in like this, maybe the laboratory setting is not actually coming to fruition in the real world.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, kind of similar to why, I was going to say similar to why the back training took off so well, but I think the fact that it has taken off that was clearly it's making a big difference for people, and that is its own kind of testing in a sense. Obviously, it's not in a lab or something, but I think if something doesn't stick around, if it's just useless for people, you're not going to keep doing it. So, Kaz, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but I think probably this is a good point to close the chat, and I think it's been a great chat about kind of all the different perspectives that you have on this new data that's coming out, and I'm excited to keep following along with what you're putting out with N1. And if you have anything else, I know you mentioned the chat that you had with Pat Davidson, who's also been on the podcast. I think you had that as available for people to purchase as like a live thing that you did with him, and people might be interested in kind of getting hold of that. But if you have anything else, let the listeners know about it, and thank you once again for coming on.
Yeah, if you guys are interested in how we're applying this stuff from an educational perspective, our biomechanics course is where we essentially cover the foundational stuff for this. If you guys are interested in just show me the exercise, we have our full exercise library on N1 training. What I would, for those of you guys, like the pull around find out thing, that's probably the best thing that I can say is that if you are very interested in training, if you're going to spend a ton of time, even if it's not through us, take advantage of the information that's out there and go after it. If you're interested in that thing from Pat, it is available virtually. I think it's $150, and basically we debated for half a day, and then we went on the floor, and Pat basically took people through essentially one of his drills that he does. That's, he's looking to improve either somebody's coordination or their ownership of a position. And then I had them follow that up with like an N1 of like, hey, we're just going to put you in quote unquote like the most optimal situation to get output on this tissue. So you can kind of see the contrast of those two things and see people go through them. And then we did a follow-up like 2-hour Q&A. So I think it's somewhere, it's like 8 or 10 hours of debates and practice between two people that essentially came in with, we'll say, what would appear as largely diverging views. And this is something that, I would like to do a lot more of. I don't know if you signed up for it or not, Steve, or, and if you enjoyed at least like the social media stuff that went with that. But I think that those type of experiences where, you can have spend enough time in an intimate situation, like on the gym floor, right? Like it's awesome, like getting on the podcast and having a discussion with somebody, but to be able to like actually be on the floor and to be able to like, hey, let's get a workout in. Let's actually try, like, let's F around and find out with what the other person is doing, right? With their observation. Cause it's one thing if somebody wants to try something that I'm doing, but they're just totally mucking it up because they're just doing it off of like, oh, they watched a video of 30 seconds or whatever, versus being able to have somebody, here, and I can say, actually, no, this is what you need to do. You just need to turn this way slightly or whatnot. And all of a sudden, like, oh my God, like that is a totally different, experience. And that's kind of what happened, training with Pat, right? Like in terms of, that transition of like, oh, iliac pull downs or, whatever, to like, okay, like there's definitely something here. That's a stretch. That's a novel stimulus that I have not, achieved before. And that experience was very fun for both of us. And I would love to do more of those things. So if you're interested in that, check that out. And this is a great platform for me to actually ask. It's like, if there's anybody that you guys would like to see me do something similar to that with, like, go down in Steve's comments and let me know. Like who would you like to see, us bring out to the N1 HQ and F around and find out?
I think we've already got, I'm sure there's going to be someone that's going to comment, Mike Israel, that's got to, I'm sure that would be interesting, especially because he has, they built up the Renaissance periodization channel to be huge. So like they've got a big audience over there and they train with other people. And yeah, you could both go through like a full ROM kind of like a Mike style workout, and you could take him. You could take him through some bits and pieces. That's, at least I would find that very interesting, I think. But yeah, other people might have other people in mind. And I've listened to the 2 free chats you put out on your YouTube with Pat, and obviously I've been following the back and forth between you two. So yeah, I was definitely interested in it, and I spoke to Brian Miner a little bit about it because I know he was there as well. So I might have to purchase to see the rest. I'm sure it'll be really from what I've seen, very interesting discussions and from 2 smart individuals with slightly different perspectives. So it's always nice to kind of get that, because you challenge each other in ways that maybe you aren't challenged typically. And I know you like that, and it brings out the best in you.
Yeah. And I think even in that situation, there's a camaraderie that like kind of like, you can very clearly see that we're all just trying to get the most we can out of this training thing. Right. Yeah.
For sure. So thank you, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Kass, for coming on. I'll make sure that's all linked below so you guys can check that out. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the the mini cuts so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The mini cut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.